Growing up during the first 4 generations of home consoles had its ups and downs. While there were some fantastic games released during these years, the arcade scene typically dominated the home options from a technical perspective. Sometimes it was such a gulf in power, home versions felt like completely different games. Some developers knew they couldn't pull off the same level of visual, so they doubled down on content and gameplay to make the home version stand out more. When a new generation of consoles landed, it was always an exciting time because of the hike in power that usually followed. When the Sega Genesis showed up in 1989, seeing stuff like Ghouls and Ghosts felt like you were getting the arcade at home. In the end though, more often than not, the arcade was king, and that's all there was to it. When Street Fighter II's meteoric rise happened in 1991, it meant home consoles would see ports soon after. And as valiant as these ports were, they still fell well short of the arcade version in visual presentation. The arcade had bigger sprites, far more animation, and loads more color on screen. There really was no comparison. When the 3DO launched in 1993, it kicked off the 5th generation, or what many of us call the 32-bit era. Most of us think of this as the time when polygon gaming really started to come home in significant quantities, but it was also a time when 2D gaming really started to look exceptional. When the 3DO version of Super Street Fighter II Turbo released in November of 1994, I was blown the hell away. It was such a massive improvement over the previous home console ports, and the enhanced CD soundtrack was unforgettable. In this episode, we will be taking a look at it, and I'll tell you why it's still one of my favorite games on the platform. Most of the gameplay and content enhancements seen in Super Street Fighter II Turbo actually began life in Super Street Fighter II: The New Challengers. The opening cinematic got a big overhaul, going from the simple animation of the original to an epic shot of a full-screen Ryu charging a fireball while lightning is popping off all around him. From there we get redone portraits, a new map screen, a new scoring system, and a new announcer. There are also numerous changes to the animation, and some fighters have new moves like Ken, who was changed up a bit to differentiate him from Ryu more. 4 new fighters joined the fray as well. The first was Cammy, a British Special Forces agent who was once brainwashed to do M. Bison's dirty work. She's small but fast and has a moveset that works well against projectile-based fighters. T-Hawk is a massive Mexican Native American out to avenge the theft of his homeland by M. Bison. He has some nasty grappling moves, but can also get around the screen quickly with a few long-range attacks as well. Fei Long is an action movie superstar out to prove his skill in the Street Fighter tournament. He is a direct homage to Bruce Lee, right down to his stance, voice work, and art design. Finally, we have DJ, a Jamaican dancer, kickboxer, and musician who enters the Street Fighter tournament to find inspiration for his music. Along with each of these fighters comes 4 new stages to battle on. Cammy has a beautiful stage where you fight on a bridge set against the English countryside. T-Hawk fights in a Mexican village while a crowd cheers them on. DJ's stage takes place against a beach party with people drinking, dancing, and singing, and just having a good old time. The 4th and final new stage takes place on a balcony set against the famous Hong Kong attraction, Tiger Balm Garden. Super Street Fighter II Turbo also added speed settings, allowing you to play it how you wanted. But perhaps the biggest change you'd get here was the introduction of super combos. These attacks were capable of automatically hitting your opponent multiple times if unblocked, and should you knock them out with it, it ends with a screen-filling burst of light. Finally, Akuma would make his Street Fighter debut in this game. He was a secret boss fighter who would come out if certain conditions were met. He fights like Ryu and Ken, but has a number of new moves that can make him quite the difficult adversary.
Round 3, fight!
The 3DO version of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo is a very nice looking game. It did a fantastic job of recreating the arcade at home. The detail, the color, and the size of the fighters all come through looking the part, and set side by side, you seriously have to give credit where credit is due. Street Fighter had never looked so damn good on a dedicated home console before. Since the 3DO was an early CD-ROM based system, you do of course get a cut in animation, but it isn't nearly as bad as you'd expect. In fact, most people would really need to see it broken down by frames to tell the difference. Another area the 3DO version takes a hit is the complete lack of parallax scrolling. Many stages in Street Fighter had at least 2 layers back there, but you only get one here. Thankfully, the line-scrolling floor is intact and looks great, so it does retain some of the pizzazz of the arcade. Other than that, there is very little to complain about here. It's a great-looking title that did the platform proud and gave owners a great showpiece for their new 32-bit console. When my friends first saw it, they sat in disbelief with their mouths agape. It was a stunner and holds up well even today.
3, fight!
The music you hear in the 3DO version of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo is taken directly from the FM Towns version of Super Street Fighter 2 The New Challengers. It's a completely remixed soundtrack that takes full advantage of the CD Red Book audio. This is hands down the best Street Fighter has ever sounded. Period. No other game in the series even comes close. I have all these tracks ripped to my car MP3 player, it's that good. Here are a few of my favorites. Criticism of this title has always been rather humorous to me. Its naysayers will always bring up a list of flaws they consider game-breaking and then recommend a version that came out years later, completely marginalizing its importance at the time of its release. My opinion is quite positive of this game, both then and now. Back then, all home versions differed from the arcade in some form. These games weren't all emulation then. It was bits of the original code and assets rebuilt from the ground up to capture the look and feel of the original vision. The 3DO did an absolutely fantastic job in this regard and is immensely playable. What differences does exist from the arcade is easily adjusted to after a bit of practice. Even if you absolutely loathe the 3DO controller, you have options to help with that. The Capcom Soldier Pad works well, and there are a few other third-party pads and arcade sticks to try out there. To answer the question, is the 3DO version arcade perfect? No, it's not. But in 1994, it was certainly the next best thing. It completely destroyed any of the 16-bit home versions before it, and even when better options became available years later, it was still well worth playing. I can't tell you how many nights my best friend and I battled it out with Akuma, trying to get that perfect level 8 run with no losses. I wasn't thinking about some shortcoming like a missing frame of animation or the lack of a second layer in the background. The game played well enough and had the fun factor to guarantee hours of play. There's enough options out there today that you don't have to own a 3DO to play it anymore. But if you do have a 3DO and enjoy fighting games, this is one title you're gonna want in your collection. Since this was released in late 1994, the 3DO had thankfully underwent a few price drops. While its original asking price of $700 had been excessive to the point of absurdity, Panasonic had released the FZ10 around the time Super Turbo here showed up, with all versions of the hardware now retailing for a much more reasonable $399. That meant that right when the 3DO was getting its very best games, the hardware was in striking distance of many more people. Despite its rocky start, the 3DO had become an excellent early entry into the 5th generation of consoles, and frankly, one that is unfairly shat upon by the people who didn't actually own and support it at the time of its retail availability. While it did end up failing spectacularly in terms of sales, it had a solid 2 years of games that built a library I was quite happy with. It was no Saturn or PlayStation, but it was earlier and better supported than most of the other failed consoles at the time. In fact, it had over 250 games released officially for it, many of which were either exclusive or the best console version you could play at the time. Don't let the online hate mislead you to believe this system was worthless. Those of you that were there know just how awesome it could be, and Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo was a huge part of that. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.